The sound echoed through D Block like a gunshot. Marcus' Tank, Whitmore's size 14 boot connected with the ribs of the man on the floor, and the crack was so loud that even the hardened inmates of Pelican Bay State Prison in California flinched. The blind man didn't scream. He didn't beg. He just curled tighter into himself on the cold concrete floor of the prison yard, his white cane lying broken 3 feet away, snapped in half like a twig. Tank laughed, a deep rumbling sound that came from his massive chest, and the crowd of inmates around him joined in, their voices creating a chorus of cruelty that bounced off the 30-foot walls topped with razor wire. The autumn sun beat down mercilessly on the yard, but nobody moved to help. Nobody ever did, not when Tank was involved. Marcus Whitmore was exactly what you'd picture when you thought of a prison tough guy. 6'5", 270 pounds of muscle built up over 12 years behind bars, with a shaved head, a thick beard, and tattoos covering every visible inch of skin from his neck down to his knuckles. He'd earned his reputation the hard way, one brutal fight at a time, until even the guards gave him a wide berth. He ran D Block like a dictator, controlling everything from the cigarette trade to who got protection and who got beaten within an inch of their life. And right now, for his entertainment and the entertainment of his crew, he was making an example out of the newest transfer to their cell block, a 42-year-old blind man named Raymond Hayes who'd arrived at Pelican Bay just 2 weeks earlier. Raymond Hayes was everything Tank wasn't. Soft-spoken, thin, with graying hair and clouded eyes that stared at nothing. He moved carefully through the prison with his cane, always keeping to himself, never causing trouble, never speaking unless spoken to. The other inmates had mostly left him alone at first, out of a mixture of pity and discomfort. A blind man in maximum security seemed like a cosmic joke, a lamb thrown into a den of wolves. The guards had tried to keep him separated to give him a cell in protective custody, but Raymond had refused. He'd insisted on general population, said he didn't want special treatment. That decision, whispered through the cell blocks, had struck everyone as either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Tank had decided it was the latter. It started small, the way these things always do. Tank would knock Raymond's food tray out of his hands in the cafeteria, watch him scramble on the floor trying to find his scattered meal while his crew laughed. He'd move chairs and tables into Raymond's path, creating obstacles the blind man would stumble over, sending him sprawling. He'd slam doors just as Raymond was walking through them, or shout warnings about non-existent dangers, anything to watch the blind man flinch and fumble. The guards saw it happening. Everyone saw it happening. But in Pelican Bay, in D Block specifically, there was an unspoken rule. You didn't interfere with Tank unless you wanted to become his next target. And for 2 weeks, Raymond took it all without complaint, without fighting back, without even raising his voice in protest. That morning in the yard, Tank had decided to escalate. He'd been bored, he told his crew. Bored of the same old routine, bored of easy targets, bored of Raymond's passive acceptance of every humiliation. He wanted to see the blind man break. He wanted to hear him cry, to beg, to show some sign that the constant torment was getting to him. So when Raymond had been making his way across the yard, using his cane to navigate toward the bench where he usually sat during rec time, Tank had simply walked up behind him and kicked the cane out of his hands. When Raymond bent to retrieve it, Tank had kicked him in the stomach, hard enough to knock the wind out of him and send him to the ground. And then, while Raymond gasped for air on the concrete, Tank had started stomping. The first kick had been to the ribs, the second to the shoulder, the third had glanced off Raymond's arm as he tried to protect himself. Tank's crew circled around them, blocking the view from the guard towers, creating a wall of bodies that gave Tank time to work. This was entertainment in Pelican Bay. This was how you proved you were still at the top of the food chain. Raymond curled into the fetal position, his hands over his head, his body trembling with each impact. Tank was laughing between kicks, narrating his actions like a sports commentator. And Tank winds up for another one. Oh, that's gotta hurt, folks. Let's see if our challenger has any fight left in him. His crew was howling with laughter, some of them taking video on smuggled cell phones, others just enjoying the show. But then something happened that made Tank pause. Raymond's hand, which had been covering his head, slowly lowered. His body, which had been curled tight, began to straighten, and when he turned his face toward where Tank stood over him, there was something in his expression that wasn't pain or fear. It was something else entirely, something that made the laughter around them start to die down. Raymond's clouded eyes seemed to focus on Tank despite their blindness, and his lips moved, forming words so quiet that Tank had to lean down to hear them. "You have no idea what you've just done," Raymond said, his voice steady despite the beating he just endured. "No idea who I am." Tank straightened up, a smirk on his face, ready to deliver another kick to shut up this presumptuous blind man who dared to speak to him like he was somebody. But before his boot could connect, a guard's whistle pierced the air. 3 sharp blasts, the signal for everyone to freeze. The wall of inmates around them started to scatter, and Tank saw 4 guards jogging across the yard toward them, led by Senior Officer Chen, one of the few guards in Pelican Bay who didn't fear Tank or his reputation. Chen took one look at Raymond on the ground, at Tank standing over him with his boot still raised, and his face hardened into an expression of barely controlled fury. "Whitmore, against the wall, hands behind your head now." Chen's voice cut through the yard like a whip, and for once, Tank complied without his usual swagger. They dragged Tank to solitary confinement, threw him into a 6x8 concrete box with nothing but a metal toilet and a thin mattress on a concrete slab. The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed in the small space. Tank wasn't worried. He'd been in the hole before plenty of times. He knew the routine. They'd keep him isolated for a few weeks, maybe a month, then he'd be back in D Block, back on top, and Raymond Hayes would be even more terrified of him than before. This was just the cost of doing business, the price of maintaining his reputation. He lay on the thin mattress and stared at the ceiling, already planning what he'd do to Raymond when he got out, how he'd make the blind man's life even more miserable for getting him thrown in the hole. But 3 hours later, when the slot in his cell door opened and a guard he'd never seen before looked in at him, Tank got his first hint that something was different this time. The guard was older, probably in his 50s, with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. He studied Tank for a long moment before speaking. "Marcus Whitmore, you have just made what might be the single biggest mistake of your entire life," the guard said quietly. "And that's saying something, considering you're doing 25 to life for manslaughter." Tank sat up on his mattress, confused. Guards didn't usually talk to him like this, didn't usually engage. "What are you talking about?" Tank asked, his voice still holding its usual aggressive edge. The guard shook his head slowly. "The man you just beat in the yard, Raymond Hayes, you know what he's in here for," Tank shrugged. He hadn't bothered to find out. It didn't matter to him what any of his victims were locked up for. A target was a target. "Armed robbery, I heard," Tank said dismissively. "Some blind dude who tried to rob a convenience store or something. Who cares?" The guard's expression didn't change. "That's what his official record says, yes, armed robbery. But that's not who Raymond Hayes really is." The guard paused, letting that sink in. Raymond Hayes is a federally protected witness. He's the former accountant for the Salazar cartel, one of the most powerful drug organizations in the western United States. He testified against them 3 years ago, put 17 high-ranking members behind bars, helped the DEA seize over $500 million in assets, and shut down trafficking routes across 4 states. Tank felt something cold settle in his stomach, but he kept his face neutral. So what? He's a snitch. That just means he deserves what he got even more. But even as he said it, he felt the first tremor of uncertainty. The guard continued as if Tank hadn't spoken. Raymond Hayes was in witness protection. New identity, new life, everything. He was safe. But 6 months ago, his daughter got sick, leukemia. He broke protocol to visit her in the hospital in San Diego, used his real name to get through hospital security, and the cartel found out within 48 hours. They sent a hit team to the hospital. Raymond saw them coming somehow, managed to get his daughter out, but in the fight that followed, he killed 2 of the hitmen in self-defense. The guard's words were coming faster now, painting a picture that Tank was starting to realize he didn't want to see completed. The problem was, one of those hitmen was the nephew of a federal judge. A corrupt judge working with the cartel, but still a judge. The judge used his connections to make sure Raymond's self-defense claim was buried, made sure his witness protection status didn't matter, made sure he got charged with armed robbery based on fabricate. De-evidence and sent to the worst prison in California, Pelican Bay. They sent him here to die, Tank. The cartel has people everywhere, including in this prison, and they were just waiting for someone to make their job easy. The guard's eyes bored into Tank's. Congratulations, you just volunteered. Tank stood up now, moving closer to the door, his mind racing. What are you saying? You're saying the cartel is going to come after me because I beat up their target. That doesn't make sense. I did them a favor. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't that simple. Nothing in prison ever was. The guard sighed, and for a moment he looked almost pitiful, like he was looking at a dead man walking. I'm saying that Raymond Hayes being blind isn't an accident, Tank. The cartel found him before he got arrested, tracked him down when he broke protocol. They tortured him for 3 days trying to get information about where the DEA had hidden other witnesses, where they'd stashed evidence. When he wouldn't talk, they blinded him with acid, left him alive as a message. And then the judge made sure he ended up here in general population, where anyone could finish the job. The pieces were starting to fit together in Tank's mind, creating a picture that made his blood run cold. But if they want him dead, why hasn't he been killed yet? He's been here 2 weeks. The guard's expression grew even darker. Because Raymond Hayes, even blind, even beaten, is one of the most dangerous men in this facility. Before he became an accountant for the cartel, before he testified, before any of this, Raymond Hayes was Force Recon Marines. 2 tour in Afghanistan, 3 in Iraq, decorated combat veteran with specialized training in close quarters combat and survival. The cartel recruited him because of his skills, then kept him around because he was brilliant with numbers. But he never stopped being a soldier. Tank's mouth went dry. He thought back to the beating in the yard, to how Raymond had barely made a sound, to the way he'd positioned his body to protect his vital organs, to that moment at the end when Raymond had looked at him and said, "You have no idea who I am." It had been a warning, not a threat, but a genuine warning, and Tank in his arrogance had ignored it. The guard continued, "The cartel has been watching, waiting, trying to find the right moment. They have 3 confirmed associates in D Block alone. You know who they are, Tank. Diego Martinez, Carlos Ruiz, and your boy, your right-hand man, James Keller." Tank felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. James Keller had been his second in command for 4 years, his most trusted associate, the man who watched his back in every fight, every deal, every power play. "You're lying," Tank said, but his voice lacked conviction. The guard shook his head. James Keller's real name is Jameson Castillo. His mother is the sister of Roberto Salazar, the head of the cartel. He was sent to Pelican Bay 2 years ago on a weapons charge that never should have resulted in maximum security placement. He was sent here for one reason only, to be in position when they eventually got Raymond Hayes inside these walls. The implication hit Tank like a freight train. James hadn't just been using him. James had been using him to get close to Raymond, to test the blind man's defenses, to see how he'd react to pressure. And Tank, the tough guy, the king of D Block, had been nothing more than a pawn in a game he didn't even know he was playing. Every beating you gave Raymond, every humiliation, every time you made him stumble or fall, the guard said quietly, James was watching, studying, learning. And today, when you escalated to physical violence, when you really hurt him, you gave James exactly what he needed. You showed that Raymond can be beaten, that he's vulnerable, that even with all his training, he's still just a blind man who can't see the attacks coming. Tank sat back down on the mattress heavily, his mind reeling. "So what happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The guard's expression was grim. Now the cartel knows Raymond can be taken. They'll move soon, probably tonight, probably during the shift change when security is lightest. James and the others will corner Raymond somewhere isolated, maybe the showers, maybe his cell, and they'll finish what you started. And you know what else is going to happen, Tank? The guard leaned closer to the slot in the door. Raymond Hayes has been documenting everything since he arrived. Every threat, every assault, every incident. He's got witnesses, other inmates who owe him favors, who respect him for things you know nothing about. He's been building a case against you specifically, because you made yourself the biggest target. Tank's hands were shaking now, something that hadn't happened to him since he was a teenager facing his first real fight. A case? For what? This is prison. Inmates beat each other all the time. The guard's laugh was bitter. Under normal circumstances, sure, but Raymond Hayes still has connections at the federal level. The FBI, the DEA, the U.S. Marshals who were protecting him, they all consider him a valuable asset. When he files his complaint about your attacks, backed by evidence and witnesses, you won't just face prison discipline, Tank. You'll face federal civil rights charges. Assault of a disabled person, hate crime enhancements because of his race and disability, violation of his civil rights. You're looking at additional federal time stacked on top of your existing sentence. You'll die in here, Tank, not from old age. They'll transfer you to a worse facility, somewhere you don't have reputation or connections, and someone will stick a shank in your ribs before your first month is up. The cell felt like it was closing in around Tank, the walls pressing closer with each word the guard spoke. But that's only if Raymond survives tonight, the guard continued. If the cartel kills him, you become the obvious suspect. You're on camera beating him in the yard just hours before his murder. The federal investigation will focus on you as the primary perpetrator or conspirator. And the cartel, they don't leave loose ends, Tank. Once James and the others have eliminated Raymond, you're next. They'll make sure you can't talk, can't tell anyone about your connection to them. You'll have an accident in solitary. Maybe you'll hang yourself with your bedsheet. Maybe you'll have a sudden heart attack. Whatever it is, nobody will question it too hard because you're just another dead inmate with a violent history. Tank put his head in his hands, trying to process everything, trying to find a way out of the trap he'd walked into with his eyes wide open. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked finally. "Why do you care what happens to me?" The guard was quiet for a moment. "I don't particularly," he admitted. "You're a violent bully who's terrorized inmates and guards alike for over a decade. You've hurt a lot of people, ruined a lot of lives, all to feed your own ego. But Raymond Hayes is different. He's a good man who made hard choices to protect his daughter and bring down some truly evil people. He doesn't deserve to die in here. And believe it or not, I don't think you deserve to be a pawn in a cartel hit, no matter how terrible you've been." Tank looked up at the guard, seeing him clearly for the first time. "What's your angle? What do you want from me?" The guard's expression remained neutral. "I want you to tell me everything you know about James Keller's activities in D Block, who he talks to, who visits him, what he does with his time, who he's paid off, who he's threatened. I want names, dates, anything you can remember. We've suspected for months that the cartel had people inside, but we couldn't prove it. With your testimony, we can isolate their operatives, move Raymond to actual protective custody, and potentially save both your lives." Tank laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "And turn myself into a snitch, a rat. My reputation would be destroyed. I'd be dead within a week of getting out of solitary." Guard's voice hardened. "Your reputation is already destroyed, Whitmore. You just don't know it yet. The moment you put your hands on Raymond Hayes, the moment you kicked a blind man for entertainment, you crossed a line that even the hardest inmates in this place won't forgive. I've already heard the whispers on the yard. People saw what you did and they're disgusted. Not because they're saints, but because there are rules even in prison, lines you don't cross. Beating a blind man isn't tough. It's pathetic. It's weak. And when word gets out about who Raymond really is, about what he survived to testify against the cartel, those same inmates who were laughing this morning will be sharpening shanks with your name on them." Tank felt the truth of those words settle over him like a burial shroud. He'd spent 12 years building his reputation as the toughest man in D Block, and he destroyed it in 5 minutes of cruelty against someone who couldn't fight back. The respect he thought he had was revealed as fear, and fear only worked as long as people believed you were worthy of it. A man who beat the blind wasn't worthy of anything but contempt. "Even if I help you," Tank said slowly, "even if I give you everything on James and the cartel, I'm still facing federal charges. I'm still looking at more time, worse conditions, a target on my back." The guard nodded. "Probably, but you'd be alive. And if you cooperate fully, if you help us protect Raymond and dismantle the cartel's network in this prison, the federal prosecutor might be willing to make a deal. Reduced charges, transfer to a different facility, maybe even witness protection of your own if you have information valuable enough." Tank wanted to laugh at the irony. Him, Marcus Tank Whitmore, the terror of P. Alican Bay, hiding in witness protection like some scared civilian. But survival was survival, and pride didn't mean much when you were dead. "How do I know you're telling the truth about any of this?" Tank asked. "How do I know Raymond Hayes is really who you say he is, that this isn't some elaborate setup?" The guard reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph, sliding it through the slot in the door. Tank picked it up and found himself looking at a newspaper clipping from 3 years ago. The headline read, "Star Witness Testimony Brings Down Salazar Cartel Leadership." The photo showed a man in a suit standing outside a federal courthouse, flanked by U.S. Marshals. The man's eyes were clear and sharp, his posture military straight, his expression determined. But the face was unmistakable. It was Raymond Hayes. Tank stared at the photo for a long time, seeing the man he'd beaten and humiliated in a completely different light. This wasn't some weak target, some easy victim. This was a Marine. A federal witness, someone who'd faced down cartel torture and refused to break, someone who'd sacrificed his safety and freedom to put away monsters. And Tank had stomped on him like he was nothing, like he was trash, for entertainment. The shame that washed over Tank was unfamiliar and deeply uncomfortable. He'd done terrible things in his life, hurt people who probably didn't deserve it, but he'd always justified it as survival, as the way the world worked, as necessary to maintain his position. But this was different. This was indefensible. "What do you need me to do?" Tank asked finally, his voice barely audible. The guard's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes might have been approval. "Start from the beginning. Tell me everything about James Keller." And so Tank talked. He talked for 3 hours straight, telling the guard everything he could remember about his second in command. He described how James had approached him 4 years ago, offering loyalty and muscle in exchange for protection and a place in Tank's crew. He detailed the visitors James received, always the same lawyer who spent hours in the consultation room with him, but never seemed to actually file any appeals or motions. He listed the other inmates James was close to, the ones who seemed to defer to him even though James wasn't in a leadership position. He recalled conversations he'd overheard, coded language about shipments and packages that he'd assumed were about prison contraband, but might have been about something larger. The guard took notes on everything, asking questions, pushing for details Tank didn't think he remembered until the guard's prodding brought them to the surface. By the time they were done, Tank had painted a comprehensive picture of what was clearly a sophisticated cartel operation running inside Pelican Bay's walls. Drug distribution, money laundering through the prison commissary, intimidation of potential witnesses, and intelligence gathering on high-value targets like Raymond Hayes. Tank had been so focused on his own little kingdom in D Block that he'd never seen the larger game being played around him. He'd been a useful idiot, and the realization was more painful than any physical beating he'd ever received. "Good," the guard said when Tank finally ran out of information. "This is good, Whitmore. This gives us enough to move on. We'll be shifting some personnel around tonight, increasing security in certain areas, isolating the suspects you've identified. With any luck, we'll prevent any attempt on Raymond's life and start building a case against the cartel's prison network." Tank nodded, feeling exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. "What about me? What happens to me now?" The guard stood up from where he'd been crouching by the door slot. "You stay here in solitary for your own protection while we sort this out. Once we've secured the situation, we'll move you to a different block, away from your former crew and the cartel associates. You'll give a formal statement to the FBI and DEA. After that, it's up to the federal prosecutor what kind of deal you get, but I'll put in a word about your cooperation." Tank lay back on his thin mattress after the guard left, staring at the ceiling of his cell with new eyes. For 12 years, he'd thought he understood how the world worked. Strength was everything. Fear was power. Compassion was weakness. But in a single day, all of that had been turned upside down. The blind man he'd beaten was stronger than Tank had ever been, had endured torture and threats that would have broken Tank in hours. The crew he'd thought was loyal had been using him all along. The reputation he'd built was revealed as hollow, based on intimidating people weaker than himself rather than any real courage or integrity. Tank had been living a lie, and it had taken the worst mistake of his life to show him the truth. That night, lying in the darkness of solitary confinement, Tank heard sounds from the main prison. Alarms, shouting, the pounding of boots on concrete. Something was happening, something big. He wouldn't find out until the next morning what had gone down, but he could guess. The cartel had made their move on Raymond Hayes, and either the guards had stopped it or they hadn't. Tank found himself praying, something he hadn't done since he was a child, that Raymond had survived. Not because of what it might mean for Tank's own chances at a deal, but because a man like Raymond Hayes deserved to live, deserved to see his daughter again, deserved better than to die in a prison shower at the hands of the same cartel he'd sacrificed everything to bring down. The morning came with a thin beam of sunlight through the high window of Tank's cell. He was eating the breakfast that had been shoved through his door slot when he heard footsteps approaching. The slot opened again, and this time it was a different guard, younger, with a face Tank didn't recognize. "Whitmore, you've got a visitor," the guard said. "Put your hands through the slot for cuffing." Tank complied, confused. He wasn't expecting anyone, didn't have any family or friends on the outside who visited. The guards cuffed him and led him out of solitary. Down corridors he'd walked 1,000 times, but which felt different now, like he was seeing the prison with fresh eyes. They brought him to a consultation room, the kind usually reserved for meetings with lawyers. And sitting at the metal table, looking bruised but very much alive, was Raymond Hayes. His clouded eyes turned toward the door as Tank entered, and though Raymond couldn't see him, Tank had the unsettling feeling that the blind man knew exactly who had just walked in. The guards positioned Tank in the chair across from Raymond and stepped back to the corners of the room, watching but giving them space to talk. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Tank didn't know what to say, couldn't find words adequate to the situation. Finally, Raymond spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "They told me you cooperated, that you gave the guards information that helped them stop the hit last night. 3 cartel members, including your friend James, are in solitary now facing additional charges. The FBI is using your statement to build a case against the network. I'm being transferred to a federal facility with actual protective custody." Tank nodded, then realized Raymond couldn't see it. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. "I told them everything I knew." Raymond's expression didn't change. "Why?" It was a simple question, but Tank knew it carried weight. Why had Tank helped the man he'd beaten? Why had he turned on his crew, destroyed his own reputation, potentially signed his own death warrant? Tank struggled to articulate what he was feeling, emotions he'd buried for so long he'd forgotten how to express them. "Because I was wrong," he said finally. "Because what I did to you was evil, and I can't take it back, but I could at least try to keep you alive. Because you didn't deserve what happened to you, not the torture, not the blindness, not being sent here, and not what I did in that yard. You're a better man than I'll ever be, and I needed to own that, to face that." Raymond was quiet for a long time, his fingers resting on the metal table between them. "I was going to kill you," he said softly. "Did you know that? In the yard, when you were kicking me, I was counting your steps, measuring your rhythm, planning how to sweep your leg and break your knee despite not being able to see you. I could have done it. My training, even blind, I could have put you down and probably killed you before the guards intervened." Tank felt a chill run down his spine. He believed it. Looking at Raymond now, seeing past the gray hair and clouded eyes to the soldier underneath, Tank absolutely believed that Raymond could have killed him if he'd wanted to. "Why didn't you?" Tank asked. Raymond's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Because I'm not that man anymore. I used to be. In the Marines for the cartel, I did things that haunt me every day. I took lives. I hurt people. And when I decided to testify, it wasn't just about doing the right thing or protecting my daughter. It was about trying to make amends for all the wrong I'd done, trying to balance the scales even though I knew I never could. Killing you would have been easy, would have been justified even, but it would have made me the same person I was before, the person I'm trying not to be." The weight of Raymond's words settled over the room like a physical presence. Here was a man who'd had every reason to become a monster, who'd been given every excuse to embrace violence and cruelty, and he'd chosen differently. He'd chosen to be better, even when it cost him everything. Tank thought about his own choices, the years he'd spent cultivating a reputation. As someone to be feared, the people he'd hurt to maintain that image. And for what? What had it gotten him? A cell, a sentence that would likely keep him locked up until he died, and a legacy as a bully who beat blind men for fun. "I don't expect forgiveness," Tank said, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "What I did to you, it's unforgivable, but I want you to know that I see it now. I see what a coward I've been, how pathetic it was to hurt someone who couldn't fight back, how empty everything I thought mattered really is. And I'm grateful that you're alive, that they didn't get to you, that you're getting out of this block." Raymond nodded slowly. "The guard who spoke to you yesterday, Officer Chen's supervisor, he told me you might face additional charges, federal civil rights violations. I wanted you to know that I'm not pressing those charges. I've asked the prosecutor to drop them." Tank's head snapped up in shock. "What? Why? I beat you. It's on camera. You have every right to." Raymond held up a hand, cutting him off. "I have the right to a lot of things, Marcus. I had the right to be left alone with my family after I testified. I had the right to live my life without cartel torture and threats. I had the right to visit my sick daughter without being arrested on false charges. Rights don't mean much when the world is determined to take them away. But I also have the right to show mercy when someone shows genuine remorse. You made a terrible choice, but you also made a brave one when you decided to cooperate. That counts for something." Tank felt moisture on his cheeks and realized with shock that he was crying, tears running down his face in a way they hadn't in decades. "I don't deserve your mercy," he whispered. "I know," Raymond said gently. "That's what makes it mercy. If you deserved it, it would just be justice. But I believe people can change, Marcus. I have to believe that because I changed. I was a killer, and I became someone who testified to save lives. You were a bully, but you became someone who risked everything to protect the man you'd hurt. That's not nothing. That's actually something remarkable." The guards gave them a few more minutes to talk, during which Raymond told Tank about his daughter, Sarah, who was in remission from her leukemia and living with Raymond's sister in Oregon. He talked about his hopes to eventually get out of prison, his sentence having been based on fabricated evidence that federal investigators were now working to expose. He talked about what he wanted to do with his life if he ever got the chance to live it freely again. And he asked Tank about his story, about how a man ended up in Pelican Bay with a 25 to life sentence. Tank found himself opening up in ways he never had before, talking about his abusive childhood, his father's violence, his own anger that he'd never learned to control, the fight that had gone too far and ended with a man dead, and Tank in prison for manslaughter. Raymond listened without judgment, without interruption, just present and attentive in a way that reminded Tank of the counselors the prison had tried to make him see over the years, except Raymond's attention felt genuine rather than clinical. When Tank finished his story, Raymond said something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "The man you killed, you can't bring him back. The years you've wasted, you can't get them back. But the man you become from this moment forward, that's still your choice. You can go back to D Block or wherever they place you and try to rebuild your reputation as a tough guy. You'll probably fail, and even if you succeed, you'll just be starting the cycle over again. Or you can decide to be someone different, someone who uses his strength to protect instead of harm, someone who builds instead of destroys. It won't be easy. People will test you, but it's possible. I know because I did it. They came for Raymond shortly after that, guards arriving to escort him to the transfer processing area. As Raymond stood, he turned his face toward Tank one last time. I hope you find your way, Marcus. I really do. And I hope one day you can forgive yourself, because that's going to be harder than earning forgiveness from anyone else. Then he was gone, tapping his way out of the room with a new cane, leaving Tank alone with his thoughts and his guards. They took Tank back to solitary, but he wasn't alone in his cell for long. Later that day, the FBI came to take his formal statement, asking him to repeat everything he'd told the guard about James Keller and the cartel network. Tank cooperated fully, signing documents, agreeing to testify if needed, doing everything they asked. The federal prosecutor came a week later with a deal. In exchange for Tank's testimony and cooperation, they would reduce the potential civil rights charges to time served in solitary, relocate him to a medium security facility in Nevada, and put him in a cell block where none of his former associates or cartel members had reached. It wasn't witness protection, but it was a new start. Tank took the deal without hesitation. 3 weeks after the beating in the yard, Tank was transferred out of Pelican Bay in the middle of the night, shackled and hooded to prevent anyone from knowing where he was going. When the hood came off, he was at High Desert State Prison in Nevada, a medium security facility that felt like a vacation resort compared to Pelican Bay. The change in environment didn't mean Tank's problems were over. His reputation had preceded him, twisted and distorted through the prison grapevine into a dozen different stories. Some inmates thought he was a snitch who'd ratted out his whole crew. Others thought he was a coward who'd hidden in solitary to avoid cartel retribution. A few knew the truth about what he'd done to Raymond Hayes and wanted to test themselves against the man who'd beaten a blind Marine. Tank faced all of it with a patience and restraint he'd never possessed before. When people challenged him, he backed down instead of fighting. When they called him names, he accepted it instead of retaliating. And slowly, painfully, he began to build a different kind of reputation. There was an inmate named Michael Chen, a 60-year-old man serving time for fraud who was being extorted by a younger, more violent prisoner. Tank intervened, not with fists but by reporting the extortion to the guards and offering to testify as a witness. The extorter was moved to a different block, and Michael was safe. A month later, a fight broke out in the cafeteria between two rival groups, and instead of joining in or enjoying the violence, Tank positioned himself between the combatants and the weaker inmates who might get hurt in the crossfire, taking a few hits himself to shield others. The guards broke up the fight, and Tank ended up in the medical wing with a black eye and split lip, but no one had been seriously injured because he'd contained the damage. These small acts of protection and restraint began to add up. Inmates started to see Tank not as a tough guy or a snitch, but as someone complex, someone who'd made terrible mistakes but was genuinely trying to be better. The respect he earned wasn't based on fear, but on a grudging admiration for how hard he was working to change. It wasn't redemption. Tank knew he could never fully redeem himself for the things he'd done, but it was progress. It was a path forward instead of a circle of violence and rage. And every time Tank felt the old anger rising, every time he wanted to fall back into the comfortable patterns of intimidation and dominance, he thought about Raymond Hayes sitting across from him in that consultation room, choosing mercy when he could have chosen vengeance. Tank started attending the prison's educational programs, something he'd always mocked before. He got his GED, then started taking college courses through a correspondence program. He joined the prison's restorative justice circle, where inmates talked about their crimes and their victims, working through guilt and remorse in facilitated discussions. It was brutal, forcing Tank to confront the pain he'd caused over the years, but it was also healing in a way he hadn't expected. He wrote letters to the family of the man he'd killed. Letters he knew they might never read and probably wouldn't forgive. But he wrote them anyway because he needed to say the words, to acknowledge the harm, to take full responsibility. 5 years passed. Tank was 41 years old, still in prison, likely to be in prison for years to come, but fundamentally different than the man who'd stomped on a blind inmate in the Pelican Bay yard. He received a letter one day, forwarded through his attorney because the return address wasn't in the prison system. Tank opened it with shaking hands, not recognizing the handwriting. Inside was a single page, written in the careful script of someone who couldn't see what they were writing but had practiced enough to make it legible. "Dear Marcus," the letter began, and Tank recognized the name signed at the bottom before he read another word. Raymond Hayes. "I heard about what you've been doing in Nevada," Raymond's letter read. "The guards who transferred with me to my new facility have colleagues who know colleagues at High Desert, and word travels. They say you're a different man, that you've been helping other inmates, staying out of trouble, working on your education. I wanted you to know that I'm proud of you. I know we only spoke that one time, and I know our connection is born from tragedy, but I feel invested in your journey. I'm out now. Got released 8 months ago when federal investigators proved my conviction was based on falsified evidence. The corrupt judge who sent me away is under indictment, and I'm back with my daughter in Oregon. She's healthy, thriving, and we talk about you. Sometimes." Tank had to pause reading, overcome with emotion. Raymond and his daughter talked about him. The man he'd beaten and the child Raymond had sacrificed everything to protect new Tank's name and cared about his progress. The letter continued. "Sarah asked me how I could forgive someone who hurt me the way you did. I told her that forgiveness isn't about excusing what someone did. It's about refusing to let their worst moment define them forever. You made a terrible choice, but you also made a brave one. You changed. And in changing, you showed me that the path I chose, the path of mercy and redemption, actually works. You proved that people can be better than their worst selves. So thank you, Marcus, for that gift. Keep moving forward. Keep being the man you're becoming. And know that someone out here believes in you." Tank read the letter 10 times that first day, and many more times in the days and weeks that followed. He kept it tucked in his Bible, one of the few personal possessions allowed in his cell. On hard days, when the weight of his past threatened to crush him, when other inmates tested him, when he wanted to give up and slide back into old patterns, he would take out Raymond's letter and read it again. Someone believed in him. Someone who had every reason to hate him instead chose to support him. That meant something. That meant everything. 7 more years passed. Tank was 48 years old when he stood before the parole board for the first time, eligible for review because of good behavior credits and the educational programs he'd completed. The board members looked skeptical, flipping through his file with its extensive record of violence and disciplinary actions from his years at Pelican Bay. But they also saw the transformation documented in his Nevada records, the letters of support from guards and inmates alike, the testimony from the restorative justice program facilitators. Tank told them about Raymond Hayes, about the worst thing he'd ever done, and the grace he'd received in return. He didn't make excuses. He didn't minimize his crimes. He simply told the truth and said he wanted the chance to live differently if they would grant it. The parole board deliberated for 3 hours. When they called Tank back into the room, their faces were unreadable. "Mr. Whitmore," the chairwoman said, "this board has reviewed your case thoroughly. Your history is troubling, to say the least. You have caused serious harm to multiple people over many years. However, we also recognize that you have made extraordinary efforts toward rehabilitation. We are granting you parole, conditional on continued participation in anger management programs, regular check-ins with a parole officer, and a prohibition on contact with any former gang or prison affiliates. You will be released in 30 days. Tank couldn't speak. He simply nodded, tears streaming down his face, and was led back to his cell in a daze. The day of his release, Tank walked out of High Desert State Prison with a bus ticket to Portland, Oregon, $200 in gate money, and the contact information for a halfway house that had agreed to take him. He'd written to Raymond Hayes to inform him of the parole decision, but he hadn't asked for anything, hadn't expected anything beyond maybe a congratulatory note. So when Tank stepped off the bus in Portland and saw a man waiting at the station with a sign that read Marcus Whitmore, it took him a moment to process what was happening. The man was in his 50s, with gray hair and eyes that looked past Tank rather than at him. Raymond Hayes in person, with a service dog at his side and a smile on his face. "Raymond," Tank's voice cracked on the name. You didn't have to," Raymond's smile widened. "I know I didn't have to, I wanted to. You have no place to go, no job lined up, no support system. I've been where you are, Marcus, starting over with nothing after everything fell apart. I want to help if you'll let me." Tank couldn't find words, so he just reached out and shook Raymond's hand, the handshake turning into an embrace that neither man pulled away from for a long moment. Raymond had arranged everything. A job at a construction company owned by a friend who believed in second chances. A small apartment near the halfway house. Introduction to a community group for formerly incarcerated people working on reintegration. And most importantly, an invitation to dinner with Raymond and his daughter Sarah, now a healthy 20-year-old college student studying social work. Sitting at Raymond's dinner table that first night, sharing a meal with the man he'd brutalized and the daughter that man had sacrificed everything to protect, Tank felt the full weight of his journey. From the violent bully in Pelican Bay's yard to this moment of grace and redemption, he had traveled an impossible distance. Sarah asked him about his plans, his hopes, his fears about life outside. Prison, Tank answered honestly, admitting his terror that he'd fail, that he'd fall back into old patterns, that he wasn't strong enough to sustain the changes he'd made. Raymond listened to all of it, then said something that would become Tank's guiding principle for the rest of his life. "Strength isn't about how hard you can hit, Marcus. It's not about how much fear you can create or how tough you appear to others. Real strength is choosing to be kind when you want to be cruel. It's choosing to build up when it would be easier to tear down. It's showing up every day and doing the hard work of being better, even when no one is watching, even when you don't get credit for it. You have that strength. You've proven it. Now you just have to keep proving it one day at a time for the rest of your life. And you won't be doing it alone. You have people who believe in you now. You have me." Tank stayed in Portland, worked construction, attended his programs, checked in with his parole officer, and slowly built a life he never imagined possible. He volunteered at youth detention centers, talking to kids who reminded him of his younger self, trying to reach them before they went as far down the wrong path as he had. He joined Raymond's church, finding a community that welcomed him despite his past. And he maintained his friendship with Raymond, the two men bonding over their shared understanding that redemption wasn't a destination but a daily practice. They would never forget where they'd come from, the violence they'd experienced and inflicted, but they also wouldn't let it define where they were going. 10 years after Tank's release, he stood in a community center in Portland, speaking to a room full of formerly incarcerated people who were struggling with reintegration. He told them his story, holding nothing back. The violence, the cruelty, the day he beat a blind man in a prison yard and thought he was showing strength. The moment that mistake cost him everything and gave him everything. The grace he received from the man he'd hurt. The long, difficult journey toward becoming someone different. And the truth he'd learned that had transformed his life. That real strength was choosing to be better every single day, no matter how hard it got. In the back of the room, Raymond Hayes sat with his service dog, listening to Tank speak. He couldn't see the tears on Tank's face or the faces of the people in the audience who were crying along with him, moved by the raw honesty of his testimony. But Raymond could hear the strength in Tank's voice, the conviction, the genuine desire to help others avoid the mistakes he'd made. And Raymond smiled, knowing that the mercy he'd extended in that prison consultation room all those years ago had borne fruit beyond anything he could have imagined. Two broken men, brought together by violence, had chosen a different path, and in choosing it, they had proven that redemption was always possible, that no one was beyond hope, that the worst thing you'd ever done didn't have to be the last thing you'd ever do. Tank finished his speech to applause, then opened the floor for questions. A young man in the front row, probably in his mid-20s, raised his hand. "How do you live with what you did? How do you forgive yourself?" Tank was quiet for a moment, considering the question carefully. "I don't know if I have forgiven myself," he admitted. "I'm not sure I ever fully will, but I've learned that maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is to live in a way that honors the grace I was given, to pay forward the mercy that was shown to me. I can't undo the past, but I can work every day to make sure my future looks different. And some days that's enough. Some days it has to be." The young man nodded, seeming satisfied with that answer. Others asked questions, shared their own stories, created a space of vulnerability and hope. After the meeting ended, people lingered to talk to Tank personally, to shake his hand, to thank him for his honesty. Raymond made his way to the front of the room, guided by his service dog, and placed a hand on Tank's shoulder. "You did good tonight," Raymond said quietly. "You're helping people, making a difference." Tank covered Raymond's hand with his own, grateful beyond words for the friendship that had emerged from such a dark beginning. Walking out of the community center that night, Tank looked up at the Portland sky, stars visible between the clouds. He thought about the prison yard at Pelican Bay, about the man he'd been, about the choices that had brought him to the edge of destruction. And he thought about the choice he'd made to cooperate, to change, to accept the grace that Raymond Hayes had offered. That single choice had altered the trajectory of his entire life. It hadn't erased his past or made his crimes disappear, but it had given him a future worth living. And in a world where second chances were rare and redemption seemed impossible, that was more than Tank had ever dared to hope for. It was everything.